If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people consider them very respectable, not only because most of them are rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. But this is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbor's respect, but he gained. Well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. So, did the Hobbit gain anything in the end? He did. He gains a ring. So this is Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, published in 1937 by J.R.R. Tolkien. And of course, I released the first episode on Tolkien earlier this week, and this is the second. The Hobbit also gains a sense of adventure, a love for the quest, the experience of foreign climes, and the sort of satisfaction of being part of a journey and part of a sense of camaraderie and all of those kind of things. I talked in the first episode about Tolkien's experience of the First World War, and there's a little element of that in this book. You know, adventuring far from home with a band of friends, and you see that even more in The Lord of the Rings, the sequel to The Hobbit. And then he comes back, and he's had these experiences that he can't readily explain to the other hobbits. And there's always a slight feeling, I think, that these experiences have actually marked him so much that he isn't really a hobbit anymore. He's changed. And this will be a much profounder theme in Lord of the Rings. You know, in the first part, I was talking about how Tolkien is this philologist. He's obsessed by languages and the literature and the history of the early Middle Ages, of the lands of the Norse, you know, the North lands. And he writes this kind of English mythology, and it's full of high elves and, you know, people called Luthium. And it's everything that people hate and despise about Tolkien who haven't read him. Quite frankly, it's seen as being humorless and earnest with elves and dragons and all those kinds of things. And let's face it, no one would ever have heard of J.R.R. Tolkien had he not most improbably introduced into this world of high elves and dragons Stanley Baldwin. Stanley Baldwin smokes a pipe. He wears a waistcoat. Baldwin is the British Prime Minister 3 times in the interwar period. He's a man of the West Midlands, and I suppose he becomes a bit notorious for not having rearmed Britain. And that could be a little bit harsh. However, there is an element of truth to it. But he speaks for the English who have had enough of war and foreign troubles, and they really don't want to have anything to do with anyone else anymore. They just want to stay in their hobbit holes. But Bilbo Baggins then goes off and realizes the world is quite a dangerous place. And again, this will be a massive theme in Lord of the Rings. And Bilbo comes out of the same world that Baldwin inhabited. Baldwin is absolutely the defining politician of his age. So Baldwin celebrated domesticity, the country, nostalgia, a kind of introversion, and he sells himself as the great intra-war archetype in Britain in the first part of the 20th century. The newspapers actually call him the little man, and they're not necessarily talking about his stature. It was his ordinariness, his respectability, tending your garden on a summer evening and doing DIY at weekends, with holidays by the seaside. Go abroad? What for? So Bilbo is very recognizably, I would say, a character born of the post-World War I age of the 1920s and 1930s. So Tolkien creates him, and he's a modern figure. I mean, Bilbo has tea. Bilbo has clocks in his house. He smokes a pipe. And of course, he's in the Middle Ages, so he can't call it tobacco, so he must call it pipeweed. So we were talking in the first episode about the different linguistic registers that Tolkien uses. And I made what some listeners may have considered a ludicrous comparison with James Joyce. You know, Joyce and Tolkien's characters use different registers. They both think very carefully about the language that they infuse their books with. And it seems to me that the great beauty, the great charm of The Hobbit, which I actually think is the most perfectly conceived children's book. So the plot is that Bilbo gets chosen against his will by the wizard Gandalf to go on a quest with 12 dwarfs. It's a story very much aimed at children. The Lord of the Rings is not, but I think it's impossible to read The Hobbit when you're 8 or 9 years old and not enjoy it. It's perfectly calibrated. So the highlights are that they go across misty mountains, Bilbo gets lost, he meets a creature called Gollum who lurks in the depths of the mountains and has a ring that makes you invisible. Bilbo takes the ring, Gollum is distraught, and the last thing that Bilbo hears as he exits the cave is Gollum wailing for the ring. They go through a deep wood called Mirkwood. They get attacked by giant spiders. They get to a misty mountain where there's a dragon guarding a great treasure. The dragon gets killed, the dwarfs take back a great jewel that they'd lost, and this mountain had once been their kingdom, and the dragon had actually stolen it from them, and they get it back. And then Bilbo goes back home, and that's basically the plot of The Hobbit. But the charm of it is the collision of the modern and the archaic. So the dwarves, the dragon, the spiders, the mountains, these are all clearly drawn from the world that Tolkien studied in his day job, you know, from the Norse myths, from the Finnish myths, from the Anglo-Saxon poems. The names are taken from Old English poems, but Bilbo, he's Stanley Baldwin, dropped into this world. And that's the fun of it, I think. That's the charm and the uniqueness that makes it different from, that kind of high Victorian fantasy story that Tolkien would have read as a boy. And there's one other element, actually, which I think is really interesting. Tolkien didn't just read stories about fairies. He also read the stories of Rider Haggard, the Imperial adventure stories, which were these amazing quests. So books like King Solomon's Mines or She, which were both written in the mid-1880s about people going to darkest Africa. And if you're interested in Haggard, I also covered him in an earlier podcast. And his stories are about people discovering lost cities and mysterious queens and all this kind of stuff. And there are definite elements of that in The Hobbit, of magical keys unlocking doors and lost maps. And if Tolkien had never written anything but The Hobbit, I think The Hobbit would still be loved as one of the best children's stories ever written. But by the end of 1937, the publisher, Stanley Unwin, says, we'd love you to do a sequel. Tolkien says, well, I've had this train set in the attic, which I've been working on, and it's full of myths. And, the publishers go, oh, God. And I can imagine the color draining from their faces. Because it's the last thing you want to hear. And they say, look, no, we don't want a book about trains and, things like that. Can you basically do The Hobbit too? That's what we want. Tolkien then mumbles and grumbles and, kind of eventually starts doing it. And it gets completely out of hand. So from them commissioning it to actual publication, I think it's the best of 17 years for Lord of the Rings to actually be written. In fact, he actually wrote it as one book, but when he delivered the manuscript, Unwin decided to publish it in 3 volumes, which really angered him. So The Fellowship of the Ring was number 1. That came out in July 1954. The Two Towers came out later that year in November 1954. And the last book of what they created, the trilogy that he hated, was The Return of the King, which came out in October 1955. And The Lord of the Rings, it's no longer a children's book. I mean, children can read it, but it's clearly not pitched to the Hobbit generation. And I think that's actually quite clever, even if unintentional, because the generation that love The Hobbit are now of an age where they will absolutely love The Lord of the Rings. And there's a brilliant moment. So Tolkien is actually writing it, and he's not focusing on Bilbo. He's writing this note to Frodo before Frodo actually becomes Frodo. And what he calls him is Bingo Bolgo Baggins. And that's what he calls him before changing to the name Frodo. I mean, you couldn't have Lord of the Rings if he was called Bingo Bolgo Baggins, could you? I mean, it just wouldn't work. And I often think Tolkien's initial choices are always bad because if you remember from the first episode, he actually called elves gnomes. But also there is a character called Aragorn, who is basically King Arthur, isn't he? He's an exiled king. He's got this sword, which is, the badge of his kingship. It would be Excalibur if it was Arthur. And he wants to reclaim his throne. And he's first introduced to our heroes as a mysterious ranger, a hooded figure. And in the films, the first time you see him, he's this hooded figure, this man from the hills, sitting in the back of this inn in the shadows, and he's called Strider. But his initial name was Trotter. So if Tolkien had actually kept those names, the names of Bingo and Trotter and gnomes, who knows what might have happened. But there's also a great villain who essentially he's a kind of a satanic figure in Lord of the Rings, Sauron the Great, Sauron the Terrible. And this is a figure who has already appeared in Tolkien's collection of myths and legends, in which he initially appears as a cat. And the initial name of Sauron was Tebildo, the Prince of Cats. But look, if truth be told, he gets there in the end. But what it proves is that, names are absolutely fundamental to a story. And once you've heard the names, basically, kind of where they're coming from, what their character is going to be like. So let me just very quickly give you the plot of Lord of the Rings, because there will be listeners listening who have never read it or seen the films. So basically, the ring that Bilbo took off Gollum in The Hobbit turns out to be a ring that is the key to the fate of the whole of Middle-earth. So the whole world of mortal men and dwarves and elves and all these kind of twisted, tortured elves who become orcs, who are these kind of monsters, this ring is the key. And whoever controls the ring basically will have mastery. And Sauron is in the distant land of Mordor, and he's plotting a great military conquest of the world. But to absolutely secure his victory, he needs to get this ring. And there is a fellowship which is then formed to stop him doing that, which includes Frodo, who's Bilbo's nephew, Gandalf the Grey, stroke white, because his color changes in the movie, who's a wizard who had originally sent Bilbo on the quest in The Hobbit, Aragorn, the heir of Isildur and the rightful king of Gondor, and then there's Samwise Gamgee, my absolute favorite, who's Frodo's devoted companion and gardener. And then there's Meriadoc Merry Brandybuck, who's another brave hobbit who joins the quest and actually aids in the battle against Sauron's forces. And there's Peregrine Pippin Took, another adventurous hobbit who he kind of matures over the journey. And then there's Legolas, an elven prince from Mirkwood. And there's Gimli, who's a formidable dwarf warrior. And last but not least, there's Boromir, a valiant warrior from Gondor. I mean, it's impossible to describe it without getting a sense of, the hackles going up for people who hate this kind of stuff. But anyway, basically, they have decided that the only thing they can do to save the world is destroy the ring. And it never crosses Sauron's mind that they would want to do that because the ring is the key to great power. In the end, Frodo, who is not the kind of person who anyone would think would be a great warrior, he kind of ends up doing this great thing. He destroys the ring. So the great criticism of The Lord of the Rings from people who hate it is that it's silly and it's childish and it's escapist. And I think we can safely debunk the escapism because we talked in the first podcast about the searing impact of World War I on Tolkien. Tolkien actually starts writing The Lord of the Rings just before the outbreak of the Second World War. So we're talking late 1937, 38, 39. So the storm clouds are very much gathering. And in the first podcast, I talked about this chapter called The Council of Elrond, which is held at a place called Rivendell, where the Fellowship of the Ring, the group of the people that I just talked about, have come together to go on this mission. And they decide that they're going to go on this huge adventure. And the only way that they can defeat Sauron, this kind of great menace that is brewing in the east, is to throw away the ring into the heart of a volcano. And Tolkien is actually writing this chapter in 1939. And in real life, there are all these various people kind of sitting around saying, how are we going to defeat this terrible evil? The Nazis. How are we going to do it? And it's clearly what Lord of the Rings is about. The invention of the ring, magic rings are 10 a penny in Norse myths and legends and fairy stories and folk stories. But the ring, I think, is such a brilliant creation. And even if you despise Tolkien, the ring is a very sophisticated literary device because the ring is not just a key to power. It's not just the ultimate weapon, but it's actually a symbol of corruption, of technological and of intellectual and of moral corruption. So the more you use it, wear it, the more you become addicted to it, and over time, you lose your humanity. The ring means power, and it means mastery. It means dominion over other people, but also over the natural world. But it also is a kind of symbol of hubris, and it also kind of brings out the evil that is in you. We're talking about the mid-20th century, the age of concentration camps, of totalitarianism, of dictatorships, all these things. The ring would not have been invented by a mid-Victorian writer, maybe not even by an Edwardian writer. Tolkien is writing The Lord of the Rings at the same time that people like William Golding, who will actually go on to write The Lord of the Flies in the middle of the 1950s, who are worrying about the state of affairs, the state of world affairs, who are actually voicing their concern about it. And other people are wrestling with questions about evil and power and thinking, if we bomb the Germans, are we as bad as them? These kinds of issues are absolutely bound up with the ring, the device of the ring. So Tolkien writes about this quite a lot to his son, Christopher, who was actually training with the RAF. And this is in the context of the RAF launching bombing campaigns over Germany. And Tolkien is really against this, very hostile to this. And he frames it specifically in terms of Lord of the Rings, which he's writing as these bombing campaigns are going on. So he says, you can't fight the enemy with his own ring without turning into an enemy. And he says of the bombing campaigns that it's an ultimately evil job, for what we're actually trying to do is attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. And we shall see if it succeeds, but the penalty is, as you will know, to breed new Saurons. Essentially, The Lord of the Rings is consciously written as a mirror that is being held up to the moral dilemmas that confront the Allies in the Second World War. How much evil can you inflict in the name of defeating evil? And at what point does doing that mean that you yourself become evil? And I think that in this sense, and this is what I absolutely didn't see when I read this as a boy, but it seems very clear to me now, The Lord of the Rings is the greatest novel on the horrors of the mid-20th century. And it spans all shades and kinds. Orwell is there as well as Big Brother, equally, with Sauron. And of course, the symbol of Sauron is the giant eye in the sky, watching everything, and it will see you no matter where you hide. And that's a very Orwellian image. And I will talk about the 1960s later, because Tolkien actually became a favorite of the hippie movement. But the Alan Parsons Project, a great band, wrote an amazing song that could only have come from Lord of the Rings, and they titled it Eye in the Sky. And these are some of the lyrics. I am the eye in the sky, looking at you, and I can read your mind. I am the maker of rules. Now, clearly, that's Tolkien influenced. It absolutely is. And I can't wait for the emails that are going to come through, on that suggestion. Anyway, I digress. There's orcs and they're always telling on each other. I'll give your name and number to the Nazgul, who are the ring wraiths, the figures of terror who patrol the skies. And I think Tolkien reinvents the ghost of the Red Baron exactly here. Remember, Tolkien was in the First World War when flying machines were used on the battlefield for the first time. And this is where the Red Baron appears. And I think what he's doing with these terrifying ring wraiths, these 9 cloaked figures whose faces you never see, they're absolutely images of the Grim Reaper. And they ride on these pterosaurs. Tolkien was actually asked if they were pterodactyls, and he said no, but they're pterodactyl lids, which I absolutely love. And what he's demonstrating in Lord of the Rings is the terror that comes from the skies. So one of the things that happens at the end of Lord of the Rings is that after Frodo has thrown the ring into the volcano and the quest succeeds, the ring is destroyed, and then Mount Doom erupts spectacularly, and Gandalf gets on an eagle and he flies it in and he rescues Frodo and Sam and then brings them back to safety. And people always say, well, why didn't they just do that in the first place? Well, the answer is actually very clear. The Nazgul on their pterodactyls are essentially an air defense system. You can't penetrate it until they've been destroyed, which happens once the ring gets destroyed. Clearly, how you defend territory from an aerial intrusion is absolutely a part of it. And all the more so because Tolkien was actually an air raid warden in North Oxford during the war. And there are echoes of the Blitz, echoes of the aerial war after the Lord of the Rings. So you have, things like, with a piercing cry out of the dim sky fell the winged shadows of the Nazgul, stooping to the kill. And in Tolkien's mind, this could be the war in heaven, because he was incredibly religious, or between good and evil, or it could be the German Stukas attacking Oxford. And Tolkien actually describes people in a besieged city, besieged by the Nazgul. He says, they thought no more of war, but only of hiding and crawling and of death. And that could be about the Germans bombing London, or it could be about the British bombing Hamburg. And that thing about the British bombing Hamburg, he's aware in a way that previous writers of this kind of adventure story had not been, I think, of the moral ambiguity of the age. So when we talked about the Hobbit, I mentioned this character Gollum that Bilbo gets the ring from. So Gollum is this sort of wizened, goblin-like creature who it turns out used to be a hobbit who had been corrupted by the ring. And look, were this a Victorian story, Gollum could be a kind of vision of Grendel from Beowulf, Tolkien's great academic obsession, or he's a version of the character Gagul from Rider Haggard's book King Solomon's Mines, which was a favorite of Tolkien's when he was a boy. But actually, as Lord of the Rings goes on, it becomes clear that with Gollum and Frodo, there's a real Jekyll and Hyde quality to them, that in some ways they are mirrors to one another. And actually, as the book goes on, Gollum actually becomes more like Frodo, and Frodo becomes more like Gollum. So the classic thing that people say who hate Tolkien and hate Lord of the Rings is that it's very simplistic. It's goodies and baddies. It's black hats and white hats. And actually, you know what? That's not true at all. The great hero of the book, Frodo, at the end of the book, he's becoming increasingly corrupted, and the lines between good and evil are becoming increasingly blurred. And again, I think that's something that you write in the 1940s, but you wouldn't have written that in the 1840s and certainly not in the 1890s. And I think that there are morally complex figures who are redeemed or who are lost. I think the idea that it's just goodies and baddies, only somebody who hasn't read the book will think that. However, I do think that criticism is responding to something that I think is precisely what has made Lord of the Rings so successful, which is that it does have a very strong sense of good and evil. And Tolkien is Catholic. He believes in good and evil. He believes in God, and he believes in hell. And I think a huge part of the reason for the Lord of the Rings success is that it packages for people who may not be Christian, who may find a lot of the institutional baggage of Christianity off-putting, who may find of the theological implications of Christianity unsettling. It packages for them the incredible drama of that Christian story, of heaven and hell, of redemption, of there being good, of there being evil, in a way that is clearly incredibly powerful. Because, of course, in some way, it would actually appear to be a pagan book. It draws inspiration from the Norse myths. The characters don't go to church. In fact, there's no churches, there's no talk of God, and obviously no talk of Christ. So, let me tell you about some of the ways that I think this is a Christian book. We talked about how there is this tension between the high medieval, the medieval quality, and the 1930s, 1940s waistcoat kind of wearing England. And I think there's a similar tension between the fact that Tolkien is a very devout Catholic, and I mean really, really devout Catholic, but he's also obsessed by the literature and the spirit of the Old North, as he puts it, which is pre-Christian, and in which characters live believing that everything is going to be destroyed, and that all you can do is show courage in the face of utter destruction. It's an incredibly creative tension, I think, that runs throughout the entire book. God is not mentioned in the book. There is nothing that we would recognize as religion in Lord of the Rings. There's no overt references to anything that's Christian. But the Christian elements, I think, are clearly very, very present, of which the most obvious is the way in which Frodo and the Fellowship generally are committed to the idea that rather than use something that will make you strong, you throw it away. And the echo there of Christian idea of the crucifixion, that God himself becomes weak and suffers death, rather than manifesting himself in glory. There's the emphasis on sacrifice. Christ gives up his divine power to suffer death and thereby to redeem the world. And that is very clearly intended by Tolkien. And I'll tell you why. Because the date that he gives for the destruction of Sauron, the defeat of Sauron, the destruction of the ring, is the same day in that Christian mythology. It's the date that the creation of light happened, when God said, "Let there be light." It's the date that Abraham is supposed to have been told to sacrifice Isaac and is prevented from doing it. It's also the day that Christ is conceived in the Virgin's womb. It's the day that he suffers death, which is the 25th of March. It's a very clear signal, I think, as to what Tolkien is doing. I mean, what's odd about Lord of the Rings and what's odd about Tolkien is that in some sense, he clearly believes that the plot of Lord of the Rings really actually happened, that this wasn't a book of fiction, and that in some sense, elves and dwarfs, they did exist. And to that extent, he sees it clearly. So Christian writers had this idea that they call preparato evangelium. And what it effectively means is that pagans were in some sense aware of what was to come, the Christian story that was about to come, and that they were actually foreshadowing it. And I think that that is what Tolkien is doing in Lord of the Rings. I think that kind of power is a really, really strong explanation for why people feel it. And it may be that it's not just filling a Christianity-shaped hole in English life, but I think specifically a Catholic-shaped hole. Lord of the Rings is about loss. Everybody apart from men in Lord of the Rings ends up losing. They destroy Sauron, but as a result, they themselves are destroyed. So the elves, the dwarfs, even seemingly the hobbits, they're all going to fade because everybody says that the world of men is in a new age. And all that great kind of polycultural mix of the third age of Middle-earth is doomed. And the elves, if you remember, actually leave Middle-earth for good. There's a kind of absence there, which clearly for Tolkien on one level is about the sense of loss that he suffered during the First World War, the loss of his friends. And there's a fabulous book by Matthew Lyons titled There and Back Again, where he actually goes around following in the footsteps of Tolkien. And he points out that there is this vision of what will happen to the Shire. And in the very first draft, there's this bloody great chocolate factory that gets built. So, the woods get destroyed and you have chocolate factories. So the forests are gone. And of course, they end up polluting the rivers. But Tolkien, I think, sees this in the broader sense. So he says, I am a Christian and a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains an inner legend, may contain more clearly and more movingly some samples or glimpses of final victory. So let's face it, only a Catholic growing up in a Protestant country could frame Christian history perhaps in that same way. But it echoes a very famous line from Galadriel, who is the Queen of the Elves, who is the main figure, I gather, also in the new Amazon series. And she says she's an elvish queen whose power will be destroyed when the ring is destroyed, but who is committed to the idea that destroying the ring is the only way to win. So she is essentially allowing her own power to be destroyed in the course of a greater victory. She echoes exactly those lines that Tolkien says, together through the ages of the world where you fought the long defeat. And the long defeat is a Norse myth. There was a terrible fatalism to the sort of Viking sense of their world and their destiny. And the weird spin that Tolkien gives that is to recalibrate it as Catholic, as a Christian story. And that at the end of days victory will be won, and everything will be redeemed, and everything will be restored, and everything will be given back to life. Tolkien's Catholicism is tremendously important, and clearly he felt that it was there on every page of Lord of the Rings. But readers don't necessarily see that. And look, it's certainly not as glaring to unsympathetic readers as it is in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Look, I love C.S. Lewis's books, but people kick back against them as they think it's pure Christian apologetics. But nobody really says that about Lord of the Rings. And they don't, because it's not an allegory in the same way that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is. It's much stranger than that, and I think that Tolkien's Christianity is much stranger because it's shot through with a sense of pessimism that derives from his fascination with the Northern legends. And I think also the way in which he fuses it with echoes of contemporary events. You know, I talked about T.S. Eliot in the last episode, who was also an air raid warden during the Second World War, as Tolkien was during the Blitz. And in his The Four Quartets, Eliot is looking back to history to make sense of the horrors of the present, pretty much in the same way that Tolkien is. And in that, he meets with a kind of ghostly figure in the midst of an air raid. And then Eliot writes, in the disfigured street, he left me with a kind of valediction, faded on the blowing of the horn. And of course, this conjures up the dawn after an air raid. And in Lord of the Rings, you get this very famous moment where Gandalf the wizard is confronting the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King on his pterodactyl. So a bit like, the Nazgul has descended, a bit like a German bomber over London. And then suddenly they hear the horns in the distance wildly blowing. So it's exactly the same thing. The blowing of the horn and the blowing of the air raid horn that ends the air raid. Dawn comes, light comes. Rohan had come at last. So the echo of Little Gidding is, I think, very clear. And Eliot and Tolkien both knew this guy called Charles Williams, who was a very mystical Christian of the kind that would exactly appeal to both men. And I wondered if there's some, I don't know if Tolkien read Eliot, but that sense of air raid wardens, of danger from the sky, of the way in which it gets framed in a kind of Christian mythology, it's a very strange, inimitable mix. But both Eliot and Tolkien are doing it, and they're doing it in a way that I think speaks incredibly profoundly to people who may not be remotely Christian or may not be remotely interested in any kind of paraphernalia, the mystic man paraphernalia that these two men are respectively drawing on. Whether in poetry or in prose, Eliot and Tolkien are both kind of onto something that people clearly, not just in Britain, but around the world, find incredibly powerful and very moving. And I think it is that kind of fusion of Christian mythic ideas with a hardly won sense of, not exactly victory over the horrors of the age, but a sense that they can at least be faced. You can look into their face. And I think that's the power of it. So before I started this second episode, I think Tolkien skeptics Rearview Mirror Chronicles skeptics would have expected me to talk about three things. They would have expected me to mention the appearance of Stanley Baldwin. They may have been expecting me to dissect the air defenses of Mordor, and they would absolutely have expected Christian mythic ideas. And I think I've given you all three of these in the first half. So in the second half, I think we should talk a little bit about Tolkien's politics, which I think are really, really interesting. Honestly, they are. So please stay with me. I think The Lord of the Rings is a political book. And I also want to talk about race because this is, of course, something that the Amazon series has visibly tried to change. And Tolkien and his relationship with race is something that his critics are now, I think, probably item number one on the charge sheet. And I will be discussing all of this and more after the break. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we are back. It was one of the saddest hours of their lives. The great chimney rose up before them, and as they drew near the old village across the water through rows of new mean houses along each side of the road, they saw the new mill in all its frowning and dirty ugliness. A giant, great brick building straddling the stream which it fouled with a steaming and stinking outflow. All along by the water road, every tree had been felled. So that's from a chapter called The Scouring of the Shire in Lord of the Rings. And it describes the return of the hobbits from their great quest back to the Shire. And this vision of Edwardian rural England to discover that the developers have effectively been visiting. So this is one of the last most compelling chapters of the book. And it's almost entirely missing, pretty much entirely missing from the film versions, because the director of the films, Peter Jackson, said he really didn't know what to do with it. And I think that's such an interesting choice that he made to leave it out. And I think it's the wrong choice because, to me, this is one of the elements that clearly lifts it above the high Victorian fantasy adventure quest model that Tolkien had clearly had in mind since he was a boy. So again, one of the common things that Tolkien's critics say is, well, it's just a trite child's story of good versus evil. The baddies are defeated, good triumphs, hurrah, hurrah. And this is actually a book that's fit for infants and adolescents. I think this chapter completely gives lie to that. So clearly, at some level, there's a First World War thing going on. So famously, David Lloyd George, not someone that I like at all, had actually promised British servicemen after World War I that they would return to homes fit for heroes. And actually what they returned to was a very grey, miserable decade of the 1920s Britain. Certainly not the Roaring Twenties at all. It was an age of very high unemployment and homelessness and injured servicemen begging on the street corners and so on and so forth. So there's an element of that about it, I think, the returning veteran. It's a bit like Vietnam veterans, returning to the United States in the 1970s. The returning veteran who sort of feels miserable and betrayed. But also, I think this absolutely cuts to the heart of Tolkien's political and religious and kind of cultural vision. There is no final victory. And the hobbits return home to find that in a very banal and humdrum way, their cherished bit of England as they left it has changed. It's become modern. It's become more industrial. There are chimneys and factories. In other words, Sarehole, that beautiful country village that Tolkien grew up in, has become dirty, industrialized Birmingham. But I also think there are clearly and obviously ideological political dimensions. Tolkien was very conservative. He was insanely conservative insofar as, he must have voted because most people did vote back in those days. And I imagine he would have seen that as his civic duty. It's almost impossible to imagine him voting anything other than grudgingly for the Conservatives. But Stanley Baldwin was a builder, a great house builder. But Stanley Baldwin never went on a quest. So Stanley Baldwin is Bilbo in chapter 1, but not subsequent chapters. But on the flip side of the coin, troops are coming back and they're seeing all these houses being built. They don't like the houses. So the scouring of the Shire is written. That final brilliant chapter is written, I think, after the end of the Second World War under the Attlee government. Tolkien said that he didn't like allegory, any kind of allegory. Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. But as with the climate of the 1930s, it's hard to believe that the headlines and the cultural conversation in the late 1940s didn't influence what he's writing. So to give you some examples, the Shire is now under the command of a chief who sends out gatherers and sharers who go around, we're told, counting and measuring and taking things off to storage so the farmers don't get to see their own products again. The inns have been closed because the chief doesn't hold with beer. I mean, that sounds very much like a kind of early 20th century conservatives' complaint that do-gooding liberals and interfering bossy Labour politicians are closing all the pubs. And the authorities have recruited hundreds of policemen. In the book, they're called sheriffs, who we are told by Tolkien that they like minding other folks' business and talking big. And if any of us small folk stand up for our rights, they drag them off to the lockholes, to the prison, and so on. That being said, look, I don't think Tolkien means it deliberately. It isn't an attack on the Attlee government. I don't think he would do anything so, simplistic. But I think there is a sense in which this is, he described himself once as a sort of conservative anarchist. And I think that's exactly what he is. This is leave us alone, don't interfere. But it's also, I think, that pessimism, that gloom, because we've been led to believe that the hobbits are the incarnation of all things Englishness, good hearts, stout-hearted Englishness. And yet it turns out lots of them are actually happy to collaborate with the new regime. Lots of them are actually happy to reform. We're told that they have lost the will to fight and that they have shrunk inside their own homes. So it's very down, it's very grey. And I can understand why Peter Jackson didn't want to put it into his Hollywood movie. But I think the fact that he didn't put it in suggests to me that he misunderstood what Tolkien was trying to achieve. I mean, it appears very fleetingly as a kind of a glimpse of the future. But in that future, as I remember it, it's the orcs who are doing it, not the hobbits, which is the point, the point of Tolkien's last chapter. It's the hobbits themselves that are doing most of the heavy lifting in this sort of new regime. When I say that Tolkien is conservative, I mean, I don't think that adequately expresses the man. He's not an enthusiast for democracy, for instance, because of his obsession with kingship, for example. He's literally in favor of a sacral kingship. And this is what Aragorn becomes, this kind of King Arthur figure in Lord of the Rings. I guess this is basically Tolkien saying that there should be a Sun King with a magic sword and that everything will actually be okay. I think he believes that in the same way that he thinks elves really walked England's green and pleasant land. But I mean, clearly he is massively not of the left. He's so reactionary that basically his vision of the ideal form of government is, 637 or something. 637 actually refers to various historical contexts, such as the early medieval period, the Islamic Caliphate under Umar, or the collapse of the Sasanian Empire. The joke that I'm making implies that his political ideas are so regressive that they belong to an ancient era rather than anything that's remotely modern. But I think that's another aspect of the past that I read, where trees are chopped down to make ways for houses. It's a reminder of just how conservative what we would now call the Green Movement was for most of the 20th century. So today, by and large, green causes are associated with the left. So this is a kind of a watermelon. That's the accusation from people on the right, that you were green on the surface and red beneath it. But actually, one of the many ways in which Lord of the Rings is very, very much the novel of the 20th century is that Tolkien is way ahead of his anxieties about where the environment is going and his association to the degree that basically he's against the Industrial Revolution. There are lots of radical Greens on the left today who would say, the whole problem is actually industrial civilization. It's capitalism, and we need to get rid of it. I think Tolkien would have wholeheartedly agreed, but his solution would have been, let's go back and have a kind of commentary. And if we go back, we can have a king with a magic sword, bring back the feudal system. Throughout Lord of the Rings, industry, the destruction of trees, he loves trees with an abandon. They've got this kind of mythical sense. Saruman, the wizard who turns out to be behind the scouring of the Shire, he's actually obsessed with technology. He destroys trees, he burns them. He turns what had previously been clean-flowing rivers into slurry tips. We're told he loves wheels and contraptions and all these kinds of things. But also, again, it's a very kind of prefiguring of modern anxieties. He breeds this kind of terrifying race of monsters. He's experimenting with what we would now call genetics, I suppose, even though genetics, when Tolkien wrote the book, had never been developed. So Tolkien's such a paradoxical figure that he's so reactionary, and yet in so many ways, he's incredibly progressive. And that's obviously why hippies come to love his books, because counterculture in the 1960s falls in love with them. So that's an interesting story in itself because, his books weren't massively successful in America until somebody printed a pirate edition. I think there's something like 2 emus on the cover and a Christmas tree or something like that. It's a really obscure cover. Actually, no, I think that's a British edition. The American edition, the American version, it was a complete ripoff because the Americans then claimed that Tolkien had no copyright in America. So what he then had to do was reproduce a new edition for America that he actually did have copyright over. And of course, that comes out at precisely the moment when there's a huge appetite for countercultural stuff. So, the Vietnam War is in full swing. The hippie movement has taken off. And people start wearing these badges, I kid you not, that say, Frodo lives, Gandalf for president. And of course, this is Richard Nixon's America. And Tolkien takes off like wildfire. He is seen as a Bible for counterculture. Small is beautiful, the Green Movement, Age of Limits. And in that way, that's still part of his appeal, I think, particularly to sort of countercultural people who might otherwise, be uncomfortable with some of his politics. I mentioned the wizard Saruman, breeding these creatures, these monsters. And of course, that raises a question that is not one that people addressed Tolkien's work with 20 or 30 years ago. But they're certainly doing it now, which is about Tolkien and race. Because you see quite often how critics, particularly in America actually, who will say Tolkien, by pitting hobbits, men, and elves and dwarfs against this race of monsters called orcs, he's created a racist work, that racial assumptions permeate the Lord of the Rings. And that the North and the West are good and the East and the South are bad and, all that kind of business. So the question I had when I started this research was, is there any truth to any of that? Look, I said at the beginning of the first episode that I think Tolkien's influence on how the Middle Ages is seen is absolutely fundamental at the most popular level. And I think that idea of white-skinned, golden-haired kings with magical swords fighting black hordes of orcs is a crucial part of what animates a sense that is the study of the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages were inherently racist, and they certainly had huge problems with racism at that time. So younger academics now are saying, the whole field of medieval studies is permeated with white supremacy. And of course, this is a huge issue, especially in the United States. But he's not even a man of his time. He's a man who's reactionary even by the standards of the 1930s and 40s. So I think that if Lord of the Rings was published now, I think that sensitivity readers would not really let quite large elements of that book go through. I don't think that they would allow orcs to be described as black-skinned or swarthy. And of course, swarthy is a word now that is persona non grata. So the kingdoms of men who allied themselves with Sauron, the Dark Lord, are clearly modeled on Arabs and Ethiopians and people from the Deep South. And that's actually very clear from Tolkien's own writings, and he's drawing on that. He admits to that at the time. And the dwarfs are pretty clearly echoes of how medieval people, Christians, Catholics, saw the Jews. And here are the similarities. In The Hobbit, the dwarfs lost their homeland. There are 12 of them, like the tribes of Israel. Their language is loosely based on Hebrew. So I think that Tolkien is using it's not so much modern categories of race, but medieval categories of difference. And so in a way, I think that people would find it awkward now. But I think that Tolkien is reactionary because essentially his prejudices, if you like, they're medieval ones. When he's describing people who are allied to Sauron, attacking the city, the great city, the shining city, this city that is the capital of all that remains of a once great empire, I think he's very consciously evoking echoes of the Arab sieges of Constantinople or the Hungarian sieges of Augsburg by Otto the Great, with his outstandingly brave cavalry charge, which we also see modeled in Lord of the Rings. And I think he's doing that partly because these are the echoes that move him. They're bred of his reading, of his study. But I think also quite fairly because he's situated in a world where there really aren't any Arabs living in Oxford in the early 1950s. So he doesn't really ever come across them. He's thinking of them as people who are incredibly remote. And then when he wrote Lord of the Rings, I think it would never have occurred to him in a million years that an Arabic reader would ever read his books. And look, you may feel that that's some kind of special pleading for him, but you can see what he's doing with the medieval stereotypes, with what he does with the Jews. And look, he did know Jews. So when he's an air raid warden, his fellow air raid warden for a lot of that time was actually a Jewish scholar, and they became great friends. And Tolkien was a great admirer of the Jews, let's be honest. He's asked, when his book is published in Germany in the mid-1950s, to fill in a form about whether or not he's of Aryan stock. So he then writes a letter where he says he's really offended by being asked if he's of Aryan stock. Because, he really doesn't recognize the category. And then he writes another letter because he's asked if he's got Jewish descendants. And he says, I wish I did. I'd be very happy if I did. And finally, he gets asked if Tolkien is a Jewish name. And his response is, it is not Jewish in origin, though I should consider it an honor if it were. He was also actually very hostile to the way that Wagner portrayed Jews and the ring cycle and all that. And he hated the ring cycle and everything to do with Wagner. And I think that there is a very conscious element within his portrayal of the dwarfs who go on the mission to get their kingdom back from the dragon. I think there is a kind of an echo there. He actually said in an interview in 1962, or it might have been 1963, I do think of the dwarfs as Jews, at once native and alien in their habitation, speaking the languages of the country, but with an accent due to their own private tub. So look, no author today would ever frame it in those terms, but equally, I don't think you would look at it and say that's the words of a vicious anti-Semite, would you? I mean, come on. So Tolkien is basically recalibrating medieval negative stereotypes of Jews in a way that he sees them as heroic. And in doing that, he's doing what he always does, which is he draws on the legacy of Old English poetry. So he translated a book titled Exodus, which portrays Moses as a great warrior. So I think that's what he's doing with the dwarfs. He's portraying Jews that are medieval, that are integrated with the Northern myth. So he gives the Jews in The Hobbit, all of them have Nordic names. So he's fusing them. And you see the same thing with Minas Tirith, which is, the city that is basically loosed on Constantinople. It's a kind of a Rome that never falls. And he also compares the people who live there as having the kind of clear purity of Jewish monotheism. So what he's doing very cleverly is fusing the Roman and the Jewish. He's fusing these elements that are often not fused in a way that suggests to me that he's absolutely not anti-Semitic. He writes to his son and he says how much he deplores the racial system in South Africa, for example, his native South Africa. And there's other elements. So, for example, it's sometimes said, well, his books are all about whiteness. And look, that's actually not quite right. I mean, there was a character who we've already mentioned called Saruman the White, who is the very embodiment of whiteness, who actually turns out to be, the most dreadful ass. Similarly, the thing about the armies who end up allied, with the baddies, they are dark-skinned, they are from the south and all of this. But there's a very telling moment when one of the heroes, one of the quest heroes, sees one of them dead. And he looks at him and he feels sorry for him. And he thinks, he's a man just like me. Well, he's not a man, is he? He's a hobbit or an elf or an orc. But you get my point. He's a person of dignity, and so what's his story? And what has brought him here? How tragic that he's now lying dead. Tolkien juxtaposes light and shadow. He talks about the darkness, the Dark Lord, the black speech, all those kinds of things. And people say, golly, this is imperialism and white supremacy and stuff. But I think that's completely wrong. Those things are all there in the Norse myths, the idea of shadow versus light, and they're there in the Bible. So Tolkien's favorite saint was St. John, who writes about the light coming into the darkness. And the sense of light is very, very strong, I think, throughout Lord of the Rings. It's theologically bred. Tolkien had absolutely no interest in racial politics in the way that would be understood now. And he's writing it before that becomes a kind of current issue. We talked about how Tolkien has no interest in his German side. He absolutely identifies very strongly with the sense of being the progeny of generation after generation of people who have lived in the West Midlands, in ancient Mercia, this ancient kingdom. And that sense of identification with the West Midlands is very strong in him. So there in the portrayal of the Shire is the West Midlands. It's in Warwickshire, but it's also there in Rohan. He's talking about the Mercian kingdom, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. So Mercia is Latin for the mark, and Rohan is actually called the mark. I mean, it couldn't be any clearer, could it? Their emblem is a white horse on a green field, and that's drawing on the white horse at Huffington, which is on the side of this hill, this great green field. The language that they speak corresponds not to just Old English, but the Old English is spoken by the West Mercians. And you have this brilliant letter that Tolkien writes to his son where he's objecting basically to globalization. He's objecting to the way that everywhere is becoming the same. And he says the bigger the things get, the smaller and duller or flatter the globe gets. And what he says precisely is, it is getting to be all one blasted little provincial suburb. I love that. And Tolkien's solution to this is that he's going to refuse to speak anything but Old Mercian. I mean, you can imagine. Tolkien's reaction to globalization is, let's speak Old Mercian. So that sense of identification with this particular place, so for soil, or actually the air, he calls it. So as early as the 1970s, Tolkien is talking about the distinctive air. And interestingly, he counterpoints that with the Mediterranean world. So he's counterpointing the air of the north, so Scandinavian and Britain and Ireland with the air of Rome and Greece. But that's what's important to him. But I think it is possible to misinterpret that now. It seems to me that if Tolkien is writing, if his ambition was to write a mythology for England, it's important that that mythology, if it's to have any sense of some sense of being a mythology of England, that it should be a mythology for England as England is now, as well as it was in the 1940s when he actually wrote it. I mean, that's a demented ambition, isn't it? To write a mythology for your own country when one, as he sees it, doesn't actually exist. I mean, by any standard, you would have to say he succeeded, because Lord of the Rings would seem completely ludicrous to many writers in the 1930s and the 1940s. And indeed, he got some considerable stick from the early reviewers. a bad project that turned out to be, I have to say, one of the most successful cultural projects of the 20th century. The risk is that this mythology for England he created in the 1940s took wing in the 1950s as immigration was happening in England. Because he's writing it to the time where basically everyone is white, that there is a risk that that mythology becomes associated with a kind of England which is for white people, that type attitude. This new Amazon series has given us the peg for where they've made, I think, a deliberate attempt to change that. So if you watch it, they've got black hobbits. So that seems to be, I think, entirely appropriate. I mean, it seems entirely with the grain of everything that Tolkien's ambitions would have been. I think also Tolkien scholars would say he's created a world that was multicultural. And the different languages, I mean, basically the theme of the Lord of the Rings is different species, I guess, working together. There's no doubt that Tolkien is a product of empire, that he's read Rider Haggard, that he never questions these things. But then again, why would he? Most people don't in the 1930s or the 1940s. It seems to me completely absurd to expect Tolkien to be a man of the 20th century. I think the weird thing about him is the way in which again and again he's so reactionary that he ends up becoming, almost by our standards, don't you think? Think of his environmentalism. But his book has proved enormously successful. His critics were saying in the 1970s, even in the 1980s, it would eventually be forgotten. It was merely a diversion for teenagers. That clearly has not worked out because it's proved enormously successful. But the question then is, do you think it will continue to be one of the books that people read and reread? Look, I think so, because there's clearly something that drags you in, tugs you in. It's an incredibly well-told story, isn't it? Aside from anything else, it's an incredibly exciting adventure story with few parallels. And look, I've been talking for too long, and there's so many things that I haven't talked about. I haven't talked about Sam, my hero, as being a First World War Batman. I haven't talked enough about Gollum. But basically, I am a Lord of the Rings nerd. So this is where I think I have to leave you because I have been talking for over an hour. But since I started with the beginning of The Hobbit, I think we should end with the end of Lord of the Rings. Okay, here we go. At last, the three companions turned away, and never again looking back, they rode slowly homewards, and they spoke no word to one another until they came back to the Shire. But each had great comfort in his friends on the long grey road. At last they rode over the downs and took the east road, and then Merry and Pippin rode on to Buckland. Already they were singing again as they went. But Sam turned to Bywater, and so he came back up the hill as the day was ending once more. And he went on, and there was a yellow light and a fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. Bye for now.